The empty rocking chair creaked in the wind as Daisy Miller clutched the small blanket to her chest, her tears falling upon the finely woven wool that would never warm her child. Standing at the window of her small homestead cabin on the outskirts of Sweetwater Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1872, she watched the horizon as if it might somehow deliver what she had lost. Daisy was 22 and already a widow, her husband Thomas having succumbed to typhoid fever just 3 months before their baby was due to arrive. The difficult birth that followed took not only her strength, but also the tiny soul who had barely drawn breath in this harsh world. The doctor had told her, with gentle words that nonetheless cut like knives, that there would be no more children for her. The cabin that had once seemed so full of promise now echoed with emptiness, the small wooden cradle Thomas had lovingly crafted standing as a painful reminder of dreams unfulfilled. In the 2 months since burying her infant daughter, Daisy had barely left the homestead, barely eaten enough to keep herself alive. The neighbors had stopped coming by, unsure how to comfort such profound grief. The sound of hoofbeats broke through her reverie. Visitors were rare this far out from town, especially with winter approaching. Wiping her eyes, Daisy set the blanket aside and moved to the door, watching as a tall figure on horseback approached through the autumn-tinged landscape. The stranger rode a chestnut Mustang, his broad shoulders draped in a worn leather duster that had seen many miles. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jawline dusted with a few days' worth of beard. He pulled his mount to a stop several yards from her porch and removed his hat, revealing tousled, dark blonde hair. "Afternoon, madam," he called, his voice carrying across the yard with a gentle timbre that seemed at odds with his weathered appearance. "Name's Ethan Foster. I'm looking for the Miller place. Town sheriff mentioned a widow might have work for a passing hand." Daisy straightened her simple cotton dress, suddenly aware of how she must appear with her hair loosely falling from its pins and her eyes red from crying. "This is the Miller homestead," she replied, her voice raspy from disuse. "Though I don't recall asking for help." The man Ethan dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "Sheriff Williams thought you might need assistance with the winter preparations. Said your place could use some looking after." He kept a respectful distance, seeming to sense her wariness. Daisy's first instinct was to send him away. She wanted no one's pity, no stranger's intrusion into her grief. But as she looked past him to the untended fields, the half-repaired barn roof that Thomas had never finished, and the woodpile that wouldn't see her through the first snowfall, practicality warred with pride. "I can't pay much," she said finally, "just room and board and what little cash I can spare." Ethan nodded, his blue-gray eyes taking in the property with a measuring gaze. "That'll do fine for now, Mrs. Miller. I'm heading north come spring. Just need honest work and a place to winter." As she showed him to the small lean-to where Thomas had kept tools and where a cot could be arranged, Daisy couldn't help but notice the careful way the cowboy removed his hat upon entering her home, the respectful distance he maintained, and how he kept his eyes averted from the cradle in the corner of the main room. That night, as the autumn wind whispered through the gaps in the cabin walls, Daisy lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another human presence on her property. It had been months since she'd had company beyond the occasional concerned neighbor dropping off food she barely touched. The sound of the cowboy chopping wood by lantern light should have been intrusive, but instead, it punctuated the silence that had become her constant companion. She rose before dawn the next day, expecting to need to wake her hired hand, only to find Ethan already at work in the barn. He had organized Thomas's scattered tools and was examining the roof beams with the practiced eye of someone who'd built shelters before. "Those beams won't hold through a heavy snow," he said when he noticed her watching from the doorway. "Needs reinforcing before the first storm. Your husband started the work, but..." He stopped, seeming to realize he might be treading on sensitive ground. "Yes, Daisy said simply. Thomas had plans for many things. Ethan nodded, his expression revealing nothing, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that surprised her. I'll need to ride into town for some supplies. Is there anything you need, Mrs. Miller? The question was so ordinary, so practical, that Daisy found herself mentally cataloging household items for the first time in weeks. Flour, she said finally, and coffee if you don't mind. Over the following days, a routine emerged. Ethan worked from dawn until dusk, repairing the barn roof, chopping and stacking firewood, clearing the small irrigation ditch that fed Daisy's vegetable garden, and mending the fences around the property. He spoke little but worked efficiently, and Daisy found herself watching him from the windows as she forced herself back into the rhythms of keeping house. The first snow came earlier than expected, a light dusting that melted by midday but served as a warning of the months to come. That evening, as Daisy prepared a simple stew, she impulsively set 2 places at the table rather than bringing Ethan's portion to the lean-to as she had been doing. You should eat while it's hot, she said when he hesitated in the doorway. No sense in your food getting cold on the walk back. They ate in silence at first, the sound of spoons against bowls the only conversation. Finally, Ethan spoke. You've kept this place going well, Mrs. Miller. Not everyone could manage that alone. Daisy looked down at her barely touched stew. I haven't been managing at all, she admitted. If not for you showing up when you did. She didn't finish the thought, but they both knew the harsh Wyoming winter would have been merciless to someone in her state. Sometimes we all need a helping hand, Ethan said quietly. No shame in that. And you? Daisy found herself asking. Where were you headed before the sheriff sent you my way? Ethan was silent for a moment, as if weighing how much to share. Montana, eventually. I've been working ranches from Texas to Colorado for the past few years. Thought I might try my hand at a claim of my own. You're a long way from Montana, Daisy observed. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I go where the work takes me. Never been one to rush toward or away from anything. After that evening, their meals together became regular occurrences. Daisy found herself making an effort with the cooking again, experimenting with the preserves and root vegetables in her cellar. Ethan always thanked her with quiet sincerity, occasionally sharing stories from his travels across the Western Territories. As November deepened toward December, Daisy noticed that Ethan had begun spending his evenings in the barn working on something he kept covered with an old tarp. Curious but reluctant to pry, she didn't ask, assuming it was preparations for the winter or perhaps repairs to his saddle and tack. The first real snowfall came in the night, blanketing the world in white silence. Daisy woke to the smell of coffee brewing, a luxury she had almost forgotten. She found Ethan in the kitchen, his tall frame seeming too large for the small space as he awkwardly managed the stove. Never claimed to be much of a cook, he said apologetically as she entered, but figured you might appreciate a hot drink this morning. Daisy accepted the steaming cup, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. Through the window, she could see that Ethan had already cleared a path from the house to the barn and woodpile. The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture brought a lump to her throat. Thank you, she said, meaning more than just the coffee. Later that day, as the snow continued to fall, Daisy found herself telling Ethan about Thomas, about their dreams for the homestead, and finally, haltingly, about the baby girl who had lived only long enough for Daisy to hold her once. She hadn't intended to share so much, but something about the quiet man's presence made the words come easier. Did she have a name? Ethan asked gently when Daisy fell silent. Rose, Daisy whispered. We were going to call her Rose. Ethan nodded, his gaze steady but compassionate. That's a beautiful name. That night, Daisy dreamed not of loss, but of spring flowers pushing through melting snow, of life continuing against all odds. She woke feeling rested for the first time in months. As December settled in, the temperatures dropped further, and Ethan moved his cot from the drafty lean-to into the corner of the main room, sleeping near the fireplace after Daisy insisted it was foolish for him to risk freezing when there was space inside. They developed a rhythm in the small cabin, working around each other with increasing comfort. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Ethan unexpectedly asked, "Would you mind if I used some of the wood scraps in the barn for a small project?" "Of course not," Daisy replied, curious. "What are you making?" Ethan hesitated. "It's for Christmas," he said simply. "A surprise, if that's all right." Christmas. Daisy had been doing her best not to think of the approaching holiday, the first without Thomas, the first that should have been brightened by a baby's wondering eyes. But as she looked at Ethan's hopeful expression, she couldn't bring herself to dim it with her sorrow. "I like surprises," she said, forcing a small smile. The days leading up to Christmas were filled with quiet industry. Ethan disappeared into the barn for hours whenever the weather permitted, while Daisy found herself rummaging through trunks for decorations she and Thomas had packed away the previous year. She hung sprigs of dried berries and pine boughs, and even managed to bake a small cake using precious sugar she'd been saving. On Christmas Eve, snow fell again, large flakes drifting lazily past the windows as dusk approached. Daisy had just set bread to rise when Ethan entered, stamping snow from his boots. "If you're not too busy," he said with uncharacteristic nervousness, "I'd like to show you something in the barn." Daisy wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and followed him through the twilight. The barn was warm from the lanterns Ethan had lit, casting a golden glow over the space. In the center stood something large, still covered with the tarp she had noticed him using. "It's not much," Ethan said, standing beside the mysterious object. "And if it's not welcome, I understand completely. But I thought—" He trailed off, then simply pulled the tarp away. Daisy's breath caught in her throat. Before her stood a rocking chair, beautifully crafted from the various woods Ethan had salvaged. The arms were smooth, the seat gently curved for comfort, and the rockers perfectly balanced. It was lovely, but what brought tears to her eyes was the careful carving along the back, a delicate pattern of roses. "Ethan," she whispered, reaching out to trace the carved flowers with trembling fingers. "Every home should have a good rocking chair," he said quietly, "for whatever the future may bring." Daisy couldn't speak, overcome with emotions too complex to name. Grief and gratitude, loss and possibility, all swirled together as she stood before this gift created by hands that had been those of a stranger just weeks before. When she finally looked up at him, the expression in Ethan's eyes made her heart skip. It wasn't pity she saw there, or even simple kindness, but something deeper, a genuine care that asked nothing in return. "Thank you," she managed at last, her voice barely audible above the whisper of snow against the barn roof. "Merry Christmas, Daisy," he replied, using her given name for the first time. That night the rocking chair sat beside the fireplace, and Daisy found herself drawn to it, testing its gentle motion as Ethan read aloud from a dog-eared copy of A Christmas Carol he had carried in his saddlebags. The familiar story washed over her, and when sleep finally came, it was peaceful and deep. Christmas Day dawned bright, the world outside transformed into a glittering wonderland. Ethan and Daisy exchanged simple gifts, a hand-knitted scarf from her, a carved wooden box from him, and shared a meal that, while modest, felt like a feast after the months of barely tasting food. As January settled in with its fierce cold and short days, life in the small cabin fell into a comfortable pattern. Ethan continued to work on improvements to the property whenever weather permitted, while Daisy found herself returning to neglected tasks with renewed energy. She began to notice things again, the particular quality of winter sunlight, the patterns of frost on the windows, the satisfaction of a well-prepared meal. And she began to notice Ethan more deeply as well, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentleness of his hands despite their strength, the quiet intelligence behind his sometimes reserved manner. She caught him watching her too when he thought she wasn't looking, with an expression that made her cheeks warm despite the cold. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Daisy found herself asking, "Why did you really come here, Ethan? The truth, not just what the sheriff told you." Ethan was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I've been drifting a long time," he finally said, "taking work where I could find it, never staying anywhere longer than a season. After a while, that kind of life leaves a hollowness." He looked up at her. "When Sheriff Williams mentioned a widow out here who might need help, something told me this was where I needed to be." "And Montana?" Daisy asked softly. "Montana will still be there come spring," he replied, though something in his voice had changed, as if the conviction behind those words was wavering. February brought a brief thaw, allowing Ethan to make repairs to the chicken coop and assess the fields for spring planting. Daisy found herself making plans again, considering which vegetables to grow, wondering if they might add a milk cow if finances permitted. "We could expand the garden plot," she said one evening, then stopped, realizing she'd been thinking in terms of we rather than I. If Ethan noticed, he didn't comment, only nodding thoughtfully. "The soil looks good on the south side. Might be worth trying some different crops this year." As March approached, bringing longer days and the first hints of spring's eventual arrival, an unspoken tension began to grow between them. Ethan had said he would head north when winter broke, and though neither mentioned it, the promise of warmer days now loomed with an unexpected heaviness. One mild afternoon, Daisy found Ethan standing at the edge of the property, looking northward toward distant mountains still white with snow. She approached quietly, coming to stand beside him. "Beautiful view," she said simply. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Your husband chose well when he staked this claim." "He did," Daisy agreed. "Thomas had a gift for seeing possibilities." They stood in silence for a time, watching as clouds cast moving shadows across the landscape. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice low. "I should be making preparations to move on," he said. "The passes will be clear enough for travel soon." Daisy felt her heart constrict, but kept her voice steady. "Yes, I suppose they will." Ethan turned to look at her then, his eyes searching her face as if memorizing it. "Unless there was reason to stay." The words hung between them, filled with unspoken meaning. Daisy looked away, suddenly afraid of what might be revealed in her own expression. "The homestead will need tending," she said carefully. "There's much to be done come spring." Daisy. The gentle way he said her name drew her eyes back to his. "I'm not asking about the homestead." A gust of wind blew a strand of hair across her face, and without thinking, Ethan reached out to tuck it behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek for the briefest moment before he withdrew them, but the touch sent warmth spreading through her. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered, the admission costing her greatly. "I'm not asking you to be ready," Ethan replied, "only to be open to the possibility that someday you might be." That night, Daisy sat in her rocking chair long after Ethan had retired to his cot, her thoughts in turmoil. The idea of caring for someone again, of opening herself to the possibility of more loss, terrified her. Yet the thought of watching Ethan ride away filled her with an emptiness that rivaled her grief. March brought the first real spring rain, washing away the last of the snow and revealing the muddy promise of earth ready for renewal. Ethan spent the day clearing debris from the small creek that ran along the property's edge, returning to the cabin soaked and mud-spattered, but satisfied with the work. As Daisy handed him a towel, their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away immediately. The simple contact sparked something between them, a current of awareness that had been building for weeks. "Ethan," Daisy began, unsure what she wanted to say, but knowing something needed to be spoken. Before she could continue, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Visitors were still rare enough to be noteworthy, and both moved to the window to see 3 riders approaching through the rain. Ethan's posture changed subtly, a new alertness entering his frame. "Stay inside," he said quietly, reaching for the rifle that stood near the door. "Do you know them?" Daisy asked, alarmed by his reaction. "No," he replied, "but something doesn't feel right." The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, three rough-looking men whose appearances matched their weather-beaten saddles and ill-kept horses. The leader, a heavy-set man with a scar running from temple to jaw, called out, "Looking for Ethan Foster. Heard he might be wintering here." Ethan stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready, positioning himself between the men and the door where Daisy stood. "I'm Foster." "What's your business?" The scarred man grinned, revealing a gap where front teeth should have been. "Jed Walker. We rode together with the Sutton outfit 2 years back in Colorado. Don't tell me you've forgotten old friends." Something in Ethan's expression shifted, a hardness entering his features that Daisy had never seen before. "We weren't friends, Walker. And if I recall, you were asked to leave that outfit after cattle started going missing." Walker's grin vanished. "Ancient history. We're just passing through. Thought we'd say hello. Maybe you could offer 3 tired travelers a hot meal and a place to dry off." "This isn't my property to offer," Ethan said evenly. "And the lady of the house isn't receiving visitors today." Walker's eyes narrowed as he spotted Daisy in the doorway. "That her? Pretty little widow I heard about in town?" His gaze traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Seems you've landed on your feet, Foster. Nice cozy setup for the winter." "You need to move on," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now." The tension stretched between them, rain drumming on the roof the only sound. Finally, Walker shrugged with exaggerated casualness. "No hospitality for old comrades. That's a shame. We'll head into town then." He tipped his hat mockingly toward Daisy. "Madam?" As the 3 riders turned away, the last one looked back with a calculating expression that sent a chill through Daisy despite the relative warmth of the spring day. Once they were out of sight, Ethan came back inside, his face grim as he set the rifle down. "Who were they really?" Daisy asked. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Trouble. I worked a cattle drive with Walker once, true enough, but he was fired for theft. Those men are drifters who take what they want. I don't like that they know about you, or this place." Daisy wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold. "Will they come back?" "Possibly," Ethan admitted. "I'll ride into town tomorrow, let the sheriff know they're around." That night, Ethan moved his bedroll directly in front of the door, and Daisy noticed he kept the rifle close at hand. Despite her concern, she felt safer knowing he was there, his protective presence a bulwark against the unease that had settled over the homestead. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the previous day's visitors had been nothing but a bad dream washed away by the rain. Ethan prepared to ride to town, checking his pistol and saddle with extra care. "Bar the door while I'm gone," he told Daisy. "I'll be back before sundown." As he mounted his horse, Daisy impulsively stepped forward. "Be careful," she said, laying a hand on his knee. Ethan covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and reassuring. "Always am," he replied with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The day passed slowly for Daisy, each sound from outside drawing her attention from the bread she was baking or the seeds she was sorting for planting. By mid-afternoon, she'd worked herself into such a state of nervous energy that she decided to tackle the long-neglected task of clearing out Thomas's clothes from the small chest in the corner. As she carefully folded shirts that would never again be worn, Daisy was surprised to find that the sharp pain she expected was muted, replaced by a gentle sadness and fond memories. She found herself smiling at the brightly colored neckerchief Thomas had been so proud of, remembering his boyish delight when he'd brought it home from a trip to town. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a small package she didn't recognize. Unwrapping it revealed a delicate silver locket on a fine chain, clearly meant as a gift. Inside was a tiny space where a small portrait might go, and Daisy realized with a pang that Thomas must have purchased it in anticipation of their child's birth, a place to keep a memory close to the heart. She was still holding the locket when the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached her. Relief washed through her, and she hurried to the door, expecting to see Ethan returning as promised. Instead, the three men from the previous day sat astride their horses in her yard, and there was nothing friendly in their postures now. Daisy closed the door quickly, dropping the bar into place just as the heavy-set leader Walker reached the porch. "Now that's not very neighborly, Mrs. Miller," he called through the door. "We just came to talk business." "Please leave," Daisy called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "My hired hand will be back any minute." Walker laughed an ugly sound. "No, he won't. Your hired hand is having a nice long chat with the sheriff right now. Smart of us to cause a distraction in town, wasn't it?" He rattled the door handle. "Open up, widow. We're just going to take what valuables you have and be on our way. No one needs to get hurt." Daisy backed away from the door, her mind racing. The rifle stood in the corner where Ethan had left it, loaded and ready. She had fired it before Thomas had insisted she learn, but never at a person. "I have nothing of value," she called out, moving toward the weapon. "Just a small homestead barely getting by." "That's not what we heard," came the reply. "Word is, your husband left you with a nice little nest egg. Gold coins. Now, open this door before we lose our patience." It was true that Thomas had kept some savings, not the fortune these men imagined, but enough to keep the homestead going through lean times. The thought of these men taking not just the money but the security it represented filled Daisy with a cold anger that pushed aside her fear. She reached for the rifle just as a heavy thud shook the door, followed by another. They were trying to break it down. Daisy raised the rifle to her shoulder, aiming at the door as the wood began to splinter. Her hands were remarkably steady, her breathing calm despite the pounding of her heart. The door crashed inward, and Walker stepped through the opening with a triumphant leer that froze when he found himself staring down the barrel of the rifle. "Get out of my home," Daisy said, her voice deadly quiet. Walker's surprise gave way to amusement. "Now, little lady, you don't want to—" Daisy shifted her aim slightly and fired, the bullet splintering the doorframe inches from Walker's head. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. Walker's expression darkened. "You shouldn't have done that," he growled, stepping forward. Before he could take another step, the sound of a pistol being cocked came from behind him. "She said get out." Ethan's voice rang clear and hard in the aftermath of the rifle shot. Walker froze, then slowly raised his hands. Outside, Daisy could see the other two men already on the ground, faces in the dirt, with Sheriff Williams standing over them, shotgun at the ready. "Didn't expect you back so soon, Foster," Walker said, trying and failing to sound casual. "Figured you might try something like this," Ethan replied. "Sheriff and I laid a nice false trail, doubled back through the creek bed where you wouldn't leave tracks." He pressed the barrel of his pistol against Walker's spine. "Now move, nice and slow, before I decide the world would be better off without you in it." The relief that flooded Daisy as the three men were led away in handcuffs was so intense she found herself sinking into the rocking chair, rifle still clutched in her hands. Ethan knelt before her, gently taking the weapon and setting it aside before capturing her trembling hands in his. "Are you hurt?" he asked, eyes scanning her face. Daisy shook her head. "No, just shaken." Ethan's thumbs traced small circles on the backs of her hands, the simple touch grounding her. "You were brave," he said softly. "Braver than most men I've known." Something in his admiring gaze broke through the last of Daisy's carefully constructed walls. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a brief touch that nonetheless sent warmth cascading through her. When she pulled back, Ethan was looking at her with wonder, as if she were something precious and unexpected. "Daisy," he breathed, her name a question and answer all at once. "I don't want you to go to Montana," she said simply. "I want you to stay here, with me." Ethan's smile began slowly, then spread across his face like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I was hoping you might say that," he replied before drawing her into another kiss, this one deeper and filled with promise. Sheriff Williams cleared his throat from the doorway, looking both amused and embarrassed. "I'll just come back later about those statements," he mumbled, backing away. Daisy and Ethan barely noticed his departure, too caught up in the discovery of each other, in the realization that what had begun as an arrangement of convenience had grown into something neither had expected to find again. That night, as they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge, Ethan told Daisy the rest of his story, how he had lost his own family to fever years before, how he had been drifting ever since, unable to settle, afraid to put down roots only to have them torn away again. "I understand that fear," Daisy said quietly. "After losing Thomas, then the baby, I thought I was done with loving, with hoping. It hurt too much." Ethan nodded, his arm warm around her shoulders. "And now?" Daisy leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "Now I think perhaps the heart is more resilient than we give it credit for. That maybe it's made to expand, not just to break." As spring fully established itself across the land, Ethan and Daisy worked side by side to bring the homestead back to life. They planted the fields together, repaired the fences, and added a small corral for the milk cow Ethan purchased with some of his savings. The cabin, too, seemed to brighten, as if responding to the new hope that filled it. One evening in late April, as they sat in companionable silence, Daisy mending clothes, while Ethan whittled a new handle for a broken tool, he suddenly set his work aside and reached into his pocket. "I've been meaning to give you something," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I found it in town last time I went for supplies." He held out a small box, and when Daisy opened it, she found a simple gold band resting on a scrap of velvet. "I know it's not fancy," Ethan said, "and if it's too soon, I understand completely. But I want you to know that I'm not just staying because of the land or because you need help. I'm staying because being with you makes me feel whole again." Daisy looked from the ring to Ethan's earnest face, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. "It's perfect," she whispered, "and it's not too soon, not when you've helped me find myself again." The wedding was a small affair, held in mid-May when the wildflowers carpeted the meadows around the homestead. Sheriff Williams stood as witness, along with a few neighbors who had become friends during the difficult winter. Daisy wore her best dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Ethan looked almost unrecognizable in a new shirt and carefully trimmed beard. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to honor the past while building a future together, to cherish each day as the gift it was, to face whatever came with united strength. That night, as husband and wife, they stood together in the doorway of the small room that had been meant for a nursery, where the empty cradle had stood as a reminder of loss. Ethan had moved it to the barn months ago, unable to bear seeing Daisy's pain each time she glanced at it. "I've been thinking," Ethan said quietly, his arm around Daisy's waist, "this room should be filled with laughter someday." Daisy leaned her head against his shoulder, remembering the doctor's words that had seemed so final at the time. "I can't have children, Ethan. The doctor was very clear about that." Ethan turned to face her, his expression serious but gentle. "There are children who need homes, Daisy. Children without parents, just as I was once. We could give them what I never had, a family, a place to belong." The idea took root in Daisy's heart immediately, as if it had been waiting there all along. "You would want that? To raise another's child as your own?" "What makes a family isn't blood," Ethan replied, cupping her face in his hands. "It's love, and that's something we have plenty to give." The summer passed in a blur of hard work and shared joy as Ethan and Daisy settled into married life. They expanded the garden, built a proper smokehouse, and began construction on an addition to the cabin that would someday house the family they hoped to create. In late August, a letter arrived from the orphanage in Cheyenne that they had contacted. A 6-month-old boy needed a home. His mother had died in childbirth, his father in a mining accident soon after. Would they be willing to take him? The journey to Cheyenne was the farthest Daisy had traveled since coming west as a bride 3 years earlier. The bustling territorial capital was overwhelming after the quiet of their homestead, but she barely noticed the crowds and noise, focused entirely on the meeting ahead. The orphanage was a stark but clean building near the edge of town. Inside, a stern-faced matron led them to a small room where several cribs stood in rows. In one, a dark-haired infant lay awake, solemnly studying his own hands. "This is David," the matron said, "healthy despite his circumstances, quiet temperament." Daisy approached the crib slowly, her heart pounding. The baby looked up at her approach, dark eyes curious in his round face. When she reached out a tentative finger, he grasped it immediately, his grip surprisingly strong. She looked back at Ethan, who stood watching with an expression of wonder. "He's perfect," she whispered. The journey home with their new son was nerve-wracking and joyous in equal measure. David proved to be an easy baby, content to observe the passing landscape from the safety of Daisy's arms, occasionally breaking into a gummy smile that melted both their hearts. As they approached the homestead, Daisy felt a flutter of anxiety. What if he doesn't like it here? What if we're not good parents? Ethan reached across the wagon seat to squeeze her hand. "We'll learn together," he assured her. "And this land is a good place to grow up. There's room to run, animals to care for, seasons to witness. We'll give him roots and wings both." That first night, as David slept in the cradle Ethan had carefully brought from the barn and refinished, they stood together watching the steady rise and fall of his tiny chest. "Thank you," Daisy said softly. "For what?" Ethan asked, his arm warm around her waist. "For everything. For staying when you could have gone. For seeing possibility when all I could see was loss. For this." She gestured to the sleeping baby, to the home around them, to the life they were building together. Ethan kissed her gently. "Thank you for being brave enough to try again. For letting me be part of your story." As autumn returned to the land, painting the trees in gold and crimson, Daisy sat in her rocking chair on the porch, David sleeping against her chest, watching Ethan work in the yard. The homestead had flourished under their joint care, becoming more prosperous and welcoming than she had ever imagined possible during those dark days after her losses. She thought about the journey they had taken from grief-stricken widow and lonely drifter to family, from emptiness to fullness, from despair to hope. The path hadn't been straight or easy, but standing at this point, looking back, she could see how each step, even the painful ones, had led them here. David stirred against her, making the small sounds that preceded waking. Ethan looked up from his work as if sensing the moment, and smiled that same warm smile that had first begun to thaw her frozen heart almost a year ago. As he approached the porch, Daisy felt the familiar surge of love that still surprised her with its intensity. This man who had appeared when she needed him most, who had rebuilt not just her home but her belief in possibility, who had shown her that even after the greatest losses, life offers new beginnings if only we're brave enough to accept them. "My two favorite people," Ethan said, climbing the steps to join them. He brushed a kiss across David's dark curls, then leaned down to kiss Daisy with a tenderness that spoke volumes. David, fully awake now, reached for Ethan with complete trust, and Daisy watched as her husband took their son in his strong arms, the baby immediately settling against his chest as if he'd always belonged there. And perhaps he had, Daisy thought. Perhaps they had all been moving toward each other all along, through sorrow and hardship, through lonely winters and uncertain springs, finding their way home to this moment, to this family, forged not from obligation or circumstance, but from choice and love. As the three of them stood together on the porch of the homestead that had witnessed so much grief and healing, Endings and beginnings, Daisy thought of the empty cradle that had once symbolized all she had lost. Now it held their son each night, rocking him to sleep beneath a mobile of wooden stars Ethan had carved, a testament to how completely emptiness can transform into fullness when we open ourselves to new possibilities. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Daisy smiled, taking in the sight of her husband and son outlined against the autumn sky. "I'm thinking that home isn't just a place," she said. "It's the people who make the empty spaces full." Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes as he shifted David to one arm so he could pull Daisy close with the other. Together they stood, watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountains, a family built from broken pieces made whole again through patience, courage, and the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. As the days grew shorter and the first hints of winter returned to the air, Daisy found herself preparing for the coming season with none of the dread that had consumed her the previous year. The root cellar was full, the wood pile stacked high, and most importantly, the cabin echoed with David's laughter and the steady presence of Ethan's love. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, Ethan brought in a small wooden box he'd been working on in the barn during odd moments. He set it before Daisy with shy pride. "I made this for you," he said as she opened it to find a collection of small carved animals, a horse, a cow, a rabbit, a bear, each perfectly sized for a child's hands. "For David when he's a bit older, and maybe someday." He hesitated. "Maybe someday for brothers or sisters, too, if that's something you might want." Daisy looked up at her husband, this man who had once been a stranger, and now was the center of her world, and felt her heart swell with gratitude for the life they had built together and the future that stretched before them, full of possibilities she had once thought forever lost. "I would like that very much," she said, reaching for his hand. "Our family has room to grow." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. Nature's own way of showing how beauty can follow even the harshest seasons, how emptiness can transform into fullness, and how love, once given room to take root, can flourish even in the most unexpected places.